Okay, everybody, we've got a good vintage magazine today. Guitar Player Magazine, 1976, July, or 77, July 1977. And I had this, when I ordered this, it was $20 off eBay. 20 bucks is 20 bucks. I'm not saying it was cheap, but on the other hand, I almost thought it wasn't that expensive for a vintage magazine with Jimmy Page on the cover like that. Kind of a collector's item, in my opinion. But I used to love Guitar Player Magazine, and this is an issue I had. I actually subscribed to it in high school for a while, and I used to always buy it. Back then, you could buy it a lot of times in music stores, and I even think in grocery stores sometimes you could get a Guitar Player Magazine. But I used to buy it in, and like I said, I think I had a short subscription to it for a while, and I had this issue. Look at who's in it: Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, Earl Klugh. Now I remember him. I remember reading about him in this article, and he was from Detroit, and he played jazz on a nylon string guitar. Back then, I kind of thought he was kind of like George Benson, and I'm not sure that's as true anymore. Although maybe back then George Benson was kind of like Earl Klugh. I think George Benson got a little more mainstream over the years, but Earl Klugh was a really good guitar player. I don't know that much about him, but I just remember following him a little bit because I had this article, Jackson Browne with David Lindley. Jimmy Page playing a Dan Electro. I think he plays Dan Electro on Kashmir, but he's got a slide there, so maybe that's In My Time of Dying. Isn't that a song where he's got a lot of slide and open tuning? Who knows? Let's open this up. I'll tell you what, the writing's kind of small, and there's so much good detail in this, but I think we'll go with the time capsule approach, where we just kind of look through as an overall thing. Any one of these articles would be good to kind of drill down on. These main articles. Lee Ritenour, Pee Wee Creighton, I don't remember him. But I read this art. I read Guitar Player Magazine, and I read this specific issue of Guitar Player Magazine a lot. I read it cover to cover back in high school. Very literate. It's got small little writing and big words. There's Bob Weir. One of the things I find most interesting in Guitar Player Magazine or any Cream Magazine, some of the old vintage things I've looked at for this approach, this kind of time capsule approach, is looking at some of the ads. There's Martin license plate. Couple thoughts that come to mind. You don't really... Taylor, PRS, I don't know if they were around, if they were maybe just getting started. Okay, there's Lamar Williams. I remember that. I remember reading that, and I remember that picture. And he was in the Allman Brothers. I think he was in Sea Level, too, right? Chuck Leavell. Yeah. After Barry Oakley. Now, they had different bass players, but Lamar Williams... I don't know if he was on Brothers and Sisters. I'll have to look. I should know that. There's a bass amp. Like I said, since there's so much in this magazine, and the video's hopefully not going to be much over 10 minutes, we're not going to obviously read every word, but we'll kind of enjoy the ads. Mel Bay. Book picking. You got some books there. Okay, here we got, one of the things I think is interesting is the gear back then. These were some of the very first distortion pedals, fuzz pedals. I'd have to look in 77, they had some pedals around. I think there was fuzz, Big Muff, Deluxe Memory Man. I don't know. Some of you could remind me of what some of the pedals were. But they certainly were kind of a work in progress, I think. Although, sometimes the pedals now are so digital and high-tech, I'm not sure sometimes those old school pedals, if you like old rock, sometimes you're better off with the Memory Man, a Big Muff, some of the old pedals, Octavia, I don't know. Oh, look, there's Buddy Rich. I don't really play drums, and I didn't pay much attention to drums for a long period of my life, other than when they were bad. And I played with enough drummers and a lot of local kinds of things. Yeah, I've never been in a huge band or something that was famous, but I've learned one thing about drummers: find yourself a good one that knows that plays with music. Oh, there's a double neck. Carvin. Man, this could go on. There's so much in this. See, I remember these columns. You'd get these columns. They'd kind of they were kind of like lessons, but a lot of times the American guitar. Wizard of Ohm. These are some Ibanez. Ibanez. Ibanez in this period was kind of a high-end company. Now, I did a little short video of this, but look, there's a Cat Stevens Ovation guitar advertisement. How cool is that? Of course, Cat Stevens, I happen to, he's kind of one of the handful of people I've tried to kind of focus on a little more on this channel. That's great. Got a classical guitar column there. This was an overall, I read this a lot in high school, and I don't know if I'm a good guitar player or not, but I think however good I am or was, it made me a better guitar player because it really opened me up to a lot of different styles. I never really got into a lot of jazz or anything like that, but I do remember in this magazine, I would pay attention to people like Larry Coryell. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Lee Ritenour, a lot of people like that would be in here. Pee Wee Crayton, I don't know that much about him. You got some Lee Ritenour. In session with Sonny Rollins. See, this magazine opened me up to a lot of different styles. And, the 70s, there was a lot of different music styles that were popular back then. There's John Sebastian. Do you believe in magic? There's Earl Klugh. Okay, now Earl Klugh was from Detroit, and I remember this, and I read it because I'm also from the Detroit area, and I remember, and after I read this magazine, sometimes I'd see he was playing at different places in downtown Detroit, and it mentions George Benson in here, Baker's Keyboard Lounge in Detroit. I used to play at a piano bar in Detroit called Waltz. That was a long time ago. But when I was like 21, 20, there was still some good kind of jazz and music in Detroit. I don't know if there still is. There's David Lindley. Of course, this was right when like Jackson Browne was popular, and he was on all those great Jackson Browne albums. In fact, there's Jackson Browne. So you got kind of a Jackson Browne and David Lindley spread here. Man, it's kind of funny. I probably haven't seen this magazine since I was 18, and I read it. I mean, there's a lot to read, if you might notice. I mean, I read this a lot. I mean, and it was a good issue to have. So there's John Paul Jones. Plug in with the pros. We've got some Skinner there. You know what? This might have been, this was July 77. This was before the Leonard Skinner plane crash. I think the plane crash was in October. Okay, here we had a Jimmy Page article. And I'll probably do something, because I read this years ago. And I remember at that time, he talked about the Rain song and some of his alternate tunings. And one thing I remember him saying somewhere around in here is he didn't want to share his alternate tunings. Let's see if I can find that. Like I've said, I'm remembering this off the top of my head, and I haven't read this since, Oh, here we get some other ads. We'll just keep going. But I remember him saying his alternate tunings were a secret, and he didn't like to share them with people for like some of those really. And back then, you couldn't figure out some of those Zeppelin songs, like the Rain song. I mean, just forget it. Because if you didn't know those tunings, you'd just be, trying in vain to come up with any way to play it. And I was in my 40s before I finally realized how different those tunings were. It wasn't like, drop D or something. Ampeg. I don't know that much about. That was kind of the smaller amp. They were getting more popular. When I think of late 60s, like Hendrix, I think of stacks of amps, but Ampeg. Mitchell's speaker. We'll just kind of go through these. There's Jimmy Page. Marshall. Honer. Another thing that is kind of as a not all that young man anymore, when I look back at those, I realize that some of these brands that were kind of new back then seem so modern. Like Ibanez, I think Carvin was Ovation. And over the years, the popular perceptions of them changed. Which you could kind of say that about like Guild guitars too. In this period, Guilds were like great guitars. Then for years, through the 80s and 90s, there's D'Angelico. There's a golden era. Mossman. Nice looking guitar. Good old, you know what? There was nothing like some of that old hippie art. I remember that picture. Got some mixers and racks. I don't know. A lot of PA equipment. But there was this probably was some of the most advanced technology. If you were like a technology person in this period, this would be where some of the coolest stuff was. There's a Gretsch pedal steel. There's a Jimmy Page. Yeah, I remember this art. I mean, I read this article a lot. He talks about how Les Paul and Mary Ford. Outlaw MPC bass. Look at that. When's the last time you were at a concert like that? Yeah. Is that an Ebo? Oh. The drawing back then was all cool. The influence of the hippies, psychedelia. Boy, I'm not even that far in, and we're already... Washburn. Now, that's another guitar. I remember Washburn when I was a kid seeming like it was a pretty good guitar, I mean, it wasn't like a Martin, but I definitely remember thinking, hey, Washburn's kind of a nice car. Of course, for a lot of those years, I was still playing my old Harmony acoustic, so Washburn probably sounded like a Martin. But, I don't think Washburn has the name it did back then. It wasn't like a super fancy name at the time, but I think their guitars had more respect and cachet in the 70s than they do now. And I would say that about a number of companies that I grew up with. Let's see, let's zip through this. Got Aspen 12s, 12 strings. I don't know, Aspen guitars, 212s. Oh, there's Guild strings. Look at these are the names. Look, let's put your Guild strings on your Martin, Gibson, Fender, Ovation, Madeira, Alvarez, Epiphone. Epiphone might have been kind of a better guitar back then. I'm telling you, a lot of the cheap cheap guitars. They had a cheap guitar in '77 was a finger bleeder. You know, you could Sigma. What you notice there's no Taylor, there's no PRS. There's Jackson Browne. Yeah, I remember reading all these articles. There's Eric Clapton. Isn't that Eric Clapton with the big old double neck? What the heck? That's Eric Clapton. That would... PA hot pickups used by stars like Eric Clapton, Rick Derringer, Paul Stanley of Kiss, Dominic Troiano of the Guess Who, Morris Albert. Morris Albert, didn't he do Feelings? Am I remembering that right? Hey, we're going to move along here. The paper's kind of a little bit cheaper, but not bad. Everything you need to be a star. Yep. You need to be a star. You need a G chord, a C chord, a D chord, some beautiful women. That's what you need. Look at those keyboards. You know, the keyboard, those are, you know what? Those are kind of more like electric pianos. These really portable small keyboards, I don't think they were as common back then. They did have electric pianos you'd start to see. Hybrid pickup. You know, another thing I remember looking through these, one thing you will not see in here is an acoustic guitar amp. And I did a video a while back on acoustic guitar amps and how I actually preferred playing through a nice tube amp with my acoustic guitar. Let's zip through here a little bit. GHS Bright Bronze. Let's go through here. There's a double neck. Carvin. Yeah, I associate Carvin with the 80s. I remember in college that was kind of a hot guitar, and it was kind of a more of a modern kind of 80s type guitar. But here it is in '77. You see some Carvins. There's a contemporary keyboard music ad. Remember, you'd get a magazine. Look at that. I think that was kind of like Guitar Player magazine. Contemporary keyboard magazine. So we're at the back. Morley. It's got some more hippie art there. Tell you, it was a very different culture. Bill Lawrence pickups. I think they're still around. I don't know that much about them. What kind of guitars you got, Gibson? Yeah, there's towards the end. Well, a little longer, but man, I'll tell you, any one of those articles, particularly that one on Jimmy Page, would be worth really drilling down on. But here's got some tapes. You know, I have a couple of those old Playboy magazines, and they've got a lot of reel-to-reel ads. Playboy had a fairly upscale, obviously predominantly men audience, but they always had some high-end audio equipment for sale in Playboy, or advertised in Playboy. Mesa Boogie. Randall. I think they're still around. Pickups Velvet Hammer. Don't know those. Oh, there's David Lindley playing that lap steel on Running on Empty. And you get these big, long interviews. And then I remember these, too. You get, and the one thing I remember about this is towards the end. You got these kind of little lessons that were by teachers. There's Larry Coryell. I remember him. I don't even know what he's doing now, but I remember kind of being interested. He was kind of a jazz, like acoustic jazz player, I think, kind of like Al Di Meola or something. But one thing I noticed is, at least when I read this, I don't remember seeing any tab in there. It was all notes like that, which I prefer because I read music, so I never liked tab. There's Tommy Tedesco, had a column in here. And I remember I always kind of followed Tommy Tedesco. I think he's been dead for quite a while now, but of course he played on like every TV show theme song, all kinds of Wrecking Crew songs. I think he was the guitar player on all that Beverly Hillbillies stuff that wasn't Earl Scruggs and Lester Flatt, like a lot of their kind of jazzy, when Ellie Mae would come into the room with some evening gown that Mrs. Drysdale wanted her to try on or something, they would have that like really kind of cool jazz guitar. My favorite guitars. Yeah. Jimmy Stewart. I don't think that's the Jimmy Stewart. Album notes. Let's just finish here. Al Di Meola, Elegant Gypsy, Sun Seals. Rick Ruskin. And they Little Feat, Time Loves a Hero. That's a good album. Well, they say time loves a hero. Yeah. Well, that's it. What's new? Let's look at this. Synthesizer for guitar. Analog delay. I'll tell you that. To me, analog delay is so much better than digital delay. I don't know what all they had in terms of digital back then. I associate that more with 80s. I don't know. It's kind of one of those subtle but major changes. And there you got an Ibanez ad. Now, I've had a couple magazines from right around this time we've looked at on this channel. I think we saw Cream, Circus, Playboy, and I think this ad, that exact ad, was in at least one other magazine. Look at that's Fender strings. For some reason I thought that was an Ibanez ad, but that's for Fender guitar strings. Well, definitely a high quality magazine for a very musically literate and engaged reading public that like guitar. I've got some more of these, so stay tuned. Thanks. God bless.